Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Thanks for being with me today. So much of what I do at VegTech Invest, where I am CEO, is talk about how we are shifting the global food supply system. And that's to be more efficient. That's to be less risky. We've talked a lot about pandemic risk in our current food supply system, and to be more sustainable. It's also about being cruelty free. Now, sometimes I talk about that more than others. Some people are willing to hear that conversation more than others. But with more and more frequency, particularly for millennials and Gen Z, animal welfare, or how we treat animals, even if they're still meat eaters, is a growing concern. In fact, when I interviewed Josh Bulk when he was formerly with the Humane Society of the United States, he would tell me that the only thing Republicans and Democrats agree upon, and I think he's right on this, is about animal welfare. No one on either side of the aisle wants to see animals suffer, and they're even willing to spend a little bit more to make sure that that happens in theory. But what is it like really in practice, and how does this all coincide with our global food supply system? Today on the Plant-Based Business Hour, I want to bring on my guest. It is with huge emotion and joy that I bring the author of Animal Liberation. It is having its 50th anniversary celebration, and so much so that the author, Peter Singer, here with me today, is putting out the next edition of Animal Liberation. It's called Animal Liberation Now, and it is out today, May 23rd. Peter, thank you for being with me.
It's my pleasure, Elizabeth.
Okay, so very quick, just in case you crazy people out there don't know, Peter is a bioethics professor at Princeton University. He has authored over 25 books, including The Most Good You Can Do and The Life You Can Save. He is a member of the VegTech Invest Thought Leadership Council. And of course, he is the author of Animal Liberation, and now the author of Animal Liberation Now. So, Peter, thank you for all that you have done. I think many would say that when you wrote Animal Liberation in the 70s, there wasn't really an animal rights movement. Don't really love that phrase, to tell you the truth, but there wasn't really concern about animals then. 50 years later, have we changed? Have we had any progress?
We've certainly changed.
Hmm.
You're right. There wasn't, let's say, there wasn't a radical animal movement at all. There were, of course, the SPCAs or the RSPCA in the United Kingdom and Australia, but they were focused really on cats and dogs and maybe horses, but they were not at all doing something for farmed animals. And generally, they weren't doing anything for animals in laboratories either. They were leaving that to a couple of anti-vivisection organizations, which were widely regarded as cranks. And so there was really no attention to the general question of how are we treating the millions, hundreds of millions, billions, in fact,
Billions.
of animals we are raising for food, and what do we think about the new form of industrial farming as it then was in the 1970s, but now is simply something that we've had for 50 years, and that itself really has not improved significantly. It's improved in some countries where there's been legislation. In the United States, California and about 8 other states have passed some legislation to eliminate the worst forms of confinement of animals in factory farms, but only the very, very worst. There's still very bad forms that are permitted. And of course, they are not the states where the vast majority of American farmed animals are kept. Those are states like Iowa, Nebraska, North Carolina. They don't have any protection for what you can do to animals in factory farms. So, yeah, things have not improved very much. And because the scale has grown, because there are new players, when we look at it globally, like China, that are producing vast
Mhm.
quantities of animals that they were not in the 70s, uh, you know, overall, you'd have to say things have got worse.
I would agree with that. I would say that since the 70s, we've had protection of animal cruelty. For me, that comes in the form of something called an ag-gag law. You talk about it in your book, Animal Liberation Now. It is in states where it is against the law for people to show what happens inside the walls of animal factories. So that means there is protection for the standardized cruelty that happens within those buildings. And if you doubt anyone listening to this that it is standardized cruelty, I'll say it is against the law to do to your dog what is done in the factories. So it would be against the law to cut off your dog's tail with the scissors. And yet that is what systematically happens as called standard practice within factory animal factories. So in many ways, I think we've gone backwards. You mentioned China, the high rise that is being built or is built right now in China that has floors and floors, cement floors of pigs. What do you think about this kind of hell
Right.
on
Yeah.
earth? Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is they have built one 26-story pig. You can't really call it a farm, a pig factory, you could call it. And there's a second 26-story building going up near it. And I suspect that there will be others. Fast forward a decade, and maybe this will become the standard. Who knows? And maybe it will be copied in the United States as well. Again, we don't know that. But it's the complete negation of the images of animals in farms that we still actually see, and I mentioned this in Animal Liberation Now, we still see in children's books. The
Mhm.
animals are outside, the pigs are rooting around in the grass, the chickens are looking for seeds and something like that, or for chasing butterflies. It's the complete antithesis of this. These animals are uh, pretty much all indoors. It's a tiny percentage that are not. They are very closely confined. The air inside these places is terrible. With chickens, for example, their droppings are on the floor for months or sometimes years without being cleaned out, so the level of ammonia is extremely high. Um, it's the antithesis of everything that you think of as a traditional pleasant farm for animals. So that's the way things are, and yeah, there's a lot of things that happen that nobody would want to happen to their dog. It's you mentioned cutting off the tail, but just the confinement in which animals can't really move. I mean, the breeding sows, for example, in American pig farms, many of them are still in those narrow crates where they can't turn around. They can't move more than a single step, and they're just lying there basically all day. On concrete or metal slats because that's cheaper and cleaner to hose down, and have nothing to do all day. They're totally bored animals.
Mhm.
No one would want to keep a dog like that either.
Mhm. Yeah, and in many ways, as we say, we've you know gone backwards. As I think of California with Prop 12, which is meant to do away with these gestation crates, as they're called, and they're trying to revoke Prop 12. So these are strange times. When we look at the book Animal Liberation Now, are you arguing that animals should have equal rights, or is there something, would you say just that we need to consider them for who and what they are? Or explain how you'd like people, and how some people currently do, think about animals and how different that is to the standardized laws that we have to not protect them.
Right. So I don't mind talking about you know the movement that I'm part of as an animal rights movement in popular terminology. That's something that people can readily understand. That there are things we ought not to do to animals. That we wrong them when we do them. But philosophically, the basis of my ethics is not rights. Um, it's rather consideration of the well-being of all of those affected by what we do. So my concern is that we don't give the same weight to the interests of animals that we give to similar interests of humans. In other words, if we're causing pain or suffering to an animal, of a kind that we would not do to humans for the same purpose. This is not life-saving we're talking about, but just to produce a food a little more cheaply, and a food that we don't really need to eat. We will cause animals to lead miserable lives for their entire life. And we would never do that, obviously, to a human. So um, the principle that I take a stand on is the principle of equal consideration for similar interests. So if humans and animals have a similar interest in not feeling pain, in not suffering, then we shouldn't say, yes, but that's an animal, so it doesn't matter. I think we should say that's a being capable of feeling pain, capable of suffering. Pain is pain, whatever the species of the being, and it's equally important to avoid making non-human animals suffer as it is to make humans have similar kinds of suffering.
hmm So much to unpack there. And of course, I completely agree with you. I'll start with my own experience and then go on to Charles Darwin. And it's all related, folks, even though I am not related to Charles Darwin. The logic is I remember when I went vegan and I was 2 years in, I wasn't eating animals. I was 2 years in to not eating animals. And someone mentioned to me about the consideration of cows. And I was like, oh, well, they're never going to be considered like humans are considered. And they were like, well, that's speciesist. And I was like, well, what's speciesist? What's speciesism? And they were like, well, you're not considering that the cow has emotions. And I was like, well, I don't want anything to suffer for sure. This I know, but emotions. And then I picked up Animal Liberation, and it talks about how there are two, in my estimation from the book, there are two main philosophers, Jeremy Bentham, who first says it's not, can animals think or can they talk, but can they suffer? And I was like, okay, that much I get. Now, remember, I'm already vegan. So this is showing you sort of the limitation of humans, if you will. I was like, okay, that much I get. And then it's Charles Darwin who, in his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, determined that there were 6 common emotions, universal emotions amongst a man and animal: happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. And once that clicked for me, that animals shared the same 6 basic emotions with us, then I sort of changed how I thought about all of this. So, all of this long explanation is to ask you, do you think that humans are capable of considering others?
Oh, I do think that humans are capable of considering others. In fact, if you look at the long journey that humans have been on over millennia, I think there's a tendency to broaden the scope of the others we consider. So if you go back far enough, you basically have an ethic that says, here's my group, and the group originally was quite small, maybe a couple of hundred people, and that's my society. Those are the people I know. I see them frequently, and of course, I should care for them. If they're in trouble, I should help them. I should not harm them. But beyond that group, you don't have ethical concerns or obligations. But gradually, that's extended as we've come into more contact and understood that other groups are like us. That's grown to, from the small group or tribe to the nation, to the race, to the species as a whole. So, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the mid 20th century, we get a very clear statement signed on by pretty much all the nations of the world that says that all human beings have some rights. Um, but going beyond that boundary to non-human animals is something that is only starting to happen, I think, in a serious way. There have, of course, been philosophers and thinkers who've suggested that we ought to extend concern to all sentient beings, and some quite ancient. Buddhist teaching clearly says that, although the Buddhist practice of people in Buddhist countries is not always what it should be. But yeah, that certainly exists. And then you come to Jeremy Bentham, as you mentioned, and Darwin, and other philosophers. So I think we are now getting to the point where people generally can see that the boundary of our species is not a proper boundary for our concern, and that we should be concerned for non-human animals. And even, as you say, that they do have emotions. And a good example of that, since you mentioned cows, is the separation of the cow and calf, which is part of virtually every commercial dairy operation worldwide. Um, that clearly causes suffering to the cow who calls for her calf, sometimes for days and weeks after the calf has been taken, and to the calf, him or herself, if that calf still survives. Sometimes the male ones are often killed very soon. Um, so, that's an example of emotions, this bond that mammals have, particularly between mother and child, is there in a lot of the non-human mammals who we raise for food.
Hmm. Yeah, so much to unpack there. I just want to underscore what Peter's saying, though, that everyone understands this. The business equation of the dairy industry is to break the bond between mother and baby. That's the business proposition, and that's what it's built on. So you can consider that. Well, the reason I bring up, are people even capable really about caring about others that they don't see like themselves? I wonder, historically, would women have gotten equal rights? And let's face it, that is often one step up and two steps back. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendment never passed in the United States. It was put forth in the 70s, around the same time as animal liberation, and it never passed. It never got the majority of states. So, and then you could use this for immigrants. You could use it for African Americans. Had those people not risen and demanded their rights, would people have been able to see African Americans as they see themselves? I mean, historically, we haven't been great at doing that, and so that's where I wonder if. I don't know if people are even really capable, if it's not forced upon them legally, to do so.
Yeah, I certainly think it's useful to have the law to break habits and patterns that have existed for a long time. And so it was necessary to have laws, say, desegregating southern schools and restaurants and buses, so that people could, white people and black people could actually mix and see that it's not really a problem, of course, to associate with them in those places. So it is sometimes necessary to have that legal change. And I certainly think for animals, we do need legal change. That's true. But, as I say, I think there is acceptance of human equality now. I think I don't know that it's going to be put up, but I think the Equal Rights Amendment would be much more likely to pass now. And we've seen other significant moral changes. The most significant, in some ways, surprisingly rapid one was for gay people. The move to not only equal rights for gays, but to recognition of marriage between people of the same sex was really quite remarkable, I thought, in terms of a change in attitudes within basically a decade.
Mm-hmm. Within, speed, that transition came about, which is wonderful. Of course, wonderful. It's great to see us grow as a human race, to be more compassionate. In theory, I'll tell you. Recently, I was surprised to see on Bloomberg a new video series called "The Future" with Hannah Frye, and in her second episode, so I encourage everyone to go look at it. Hannah, a mathematician and scientist, talks about Charles Darwin and his book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And she lists the 6 emotions that they have in common: happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. Now, she, a scientist, and then she quickly sort of belittles, she, a scientist, Charles Darwin, and goes on to say, like, well, I don't know, it's sort of silly to think about pigs having emotions. And then she changes the subject after doing a deep dive on it for 2 or 3 minutes. And I remember feeling this or encountering this situation when I was my younger self in my 20s and 30s, and I was trying to find a way socially of being vegan, and I couldn't quite do it. Every time I would bring up the subject to friends, because, we all knew about animal factories at this point. We were in our 20s and 30s. We knew. We couldn't pretend we didn't know. We knew. And I would say, and I didn't know anything about dairy at that point, that, do we really need pepperoni on a pizza? And the overwhelming response would be, I think today we'd call it bullying, really belittling the comment, saying like, oh, you're a tree hugger. Oh, and I thought, you're making fun of me when this is, practically, I don't know if when I was growing up it was considered criminal behavior then, but today it would be considered criminal behavior what happens in factory farms. And I just wondered if you have had any comment about how people choose to belittle the concerns of animals when it makes them feel uncomfortable about where they are in the world, if that makes any sense.
Yes, absolutely. That is a phenomenon that has actually been documented by psychologists. There's a paper that I quote in Animal Liberation now that only came out, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, I think, in which they got students to attend for an experiment. They didn't tell them what the experiment was really about, but when they arrived, they gave them lots of questions to answer. And some of those questions were about animals. And for example, do you think a cow is capable of? And they referred to some emotions that cows might have and other animals. And then they gave them other things to do that had nothing much to do with what was really going on. And then they told them that they were going to take a lunch break, and the students were divided into two groups quite randomly. And one group was told that they were going to have hamburger for lunch, and the other group was told they were going to have salads and vegetables, a plant-based lunch. But before they sat down for lunch, they said, look, we need to go back over some of these questions that we did before, and they got them to do some of the same questions. And the ones who were told that they were going to have hamburger for lunch gave a lower estimate of the abilities and of the emotions that cows are capable of. Whereas the ones who were told they were going to have the plant-based meal for lunch didn't change. So clearly the fact that, it had been made more relevant that they were going to eat pieces of a cow affected, even within that relatively short time frame, their views about what cows are capable of. So they were kind of belittling the cows because they knew they were going to eat them, and they were going to be a bit uncomfortable if they thought, oh, these cows are beings who have a range of emotions rather like us, but here I am eating pieces of their body. Uh, so I think that the phenomenon you're talking about is clearly there and has now been well documented.
I think these sorts of changes in very basic human emotions to protect or defend one's self in their actions is hard to change. I don't know if it gives me hope or despair for the future. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's hard to change, but it's not impossible to change. And what we need to do is to build up a critical mass of people who can see that this is wrong. And of course, we're getting there. There are far more vegans and vegetarians around than there were in the 1970s. When, as I say in Animal Liberation now, when I was a graduate student at the University of Oxford, so I was 24 years old, I had my first conversation with somebody who I knew was a vegetarian. A conversation about why he was a vegetarian. I'm not saying I'd never met a vegetarian. I'd been to India. There must have been vegetarians there, of course, but they came from a different background. I wasn't going to become a vegetarian for the reasons that Hindus are vegetarians. So somebody who was basically from my culture and similar. He was Canadian, similar sort of background in terms of thought. That was the first conversation I'd had. So that really has changed a lot in those 50 years. And I think what we need to do is to keep building those people who understand this point. And then if you can get that critical mass, it will be so much easier. It is already much easier for people to change, because humans are generally, we're social animals and we're pretty conformist in terms with others in our society. And I think part of the problem with shifting to plant-based foods is, oh, if I do that, I'll be implying that what I've been eating in the past and what maybe my parents and some other members of my family and some of my friends still eat, I'll be implying that that's wrong, that they're bad people, that they shouldn't be doing that. And I'll be very uncomfortable, in saying that to them. So that makes it really difficult. But if there's plenty of company and it becomes a sort of normal thing to do, I think we have the capacity to make that change.
I put my faith there in two things happening at the same time, maybe three things happening at the same time. Gen Z and millennials who, for lack of a better expression, are willing to go there and to see animals and the way that they're treated and not believe in that. The innovation, I am indeed with VegTech Invest for a reason. The innovation that's happening in the global food supply system to make these choices so much easier. So you can just grab the choice that's sustainable, that tastes good, that costs about the same in time. We're working on that right now. And that doesn't involve animals. And then you just don't even have to ask yourself the question. And I think that that might be a faster turnaround for people to help them get to that philosophical advancement when they just don't have to think about it so much. So I have high hopes in the food system. And then, with just one more pandemic, and epidemiologists are saying that we might be in for another one sooner rather than later. So I think the more trouble we realize comes from our global food supply system being so inefficient, being destructive of biodiversity, and being just a breeding pot for pandemics will make us faster to change. We will see. I mentioned a term before, and maybe we should go back and define it for people. I mentioned speciesism, and I wondered if you could share with us what exactly that is.
Yes, certainly. Speciesism is a term that was actually coined by somebody I knew in Oxford, Richard Ryder, and I popularized it in Animal Liberation, which is intended to make the analogy between those other isms that, as we've been saying, I think we have moved beyond, at least in terms of our ethical acceptance, even if we haven't moved beyond them in practice. But racism and sexism would be the big examples, right? There are relatively few people who will openly now say, yes, I'm a racist. I think it's right to be a racist. Um, so what is racism? Racism is the domination of by one race of other races over whom the dominant race has power, and it then uses that power to its own advantage to exploit the races over which it's dominant. Most obviously, of course, in terms of slavery and the
Mhm.
dominance of Europeans over Africans. And then it develops an ideology to justify this, because we've been talking just now with animals about the cognitive dissonance that you feel if you know you're going to eat a being with a deep emotions and a capability to live a good life. Well, similarly, if you know you're enslaving a person who is really very like you and who is going to suffer by being captured and taken away from family and transported in horrendous conditions across the Atlantic and then made a slave, you would feel bad if you thought you were doing that to somebody just like you. So you develop this ideology that they're inferior, they're different, or maybe that God entitled us to do that. That was part of
Mm.
the belief of the slavery too. They found passages in the Bible that they thought justified them enslaving other races. And so the point about speciesism is to say this is a similar phenomenon. This is a dominant group that is exploiting another group and developing an ideology, sometimes religiously based, because people have quoted this verse in the Bible about God giving us dominion over the animals, and
Mhm.
they've interpreted it as if that means God doesn't care what we do to animals, we can do what we like to God's creation. Um,
I
and
didn't know that.
sometimes based on pseudoscientific claims about they're inferior to us in various respects. They don't feel things like we do. So that's the point of the analogy, to say we really are not entitled to treat animals just as things for us to benefit from. We just happen to exist alongside other species, other sentient beings on this planet. Uh, They were not given to us for any particular purpose, and so we should treat them as we would treat beings of our species, with similar, you know, with the emotions and the feelings and the capacities to suffer that they have, and we should not discount that or ignore their suffering and their capacity for well-being simply because they're not members of our species. That's the essence of rejecting speciesism.
And I think it's something anyone who's ever had a dog or a cat can easily relate to. You can see the emotional range of these animals, and you see the cognitive dissonance in saying, Legally, I won't do this to my dog, but legally, it's okay to do this to a cow. Pigs, as many know, are much smarter than dogs. They sing to their young. Chickens can remember 100 faces and 100 names. I can't even remember 100 names. Chickens can do that. So, you see the emotional and cognizant capability of the animals. I want to read, putting on my glasses, everybody. This was in Animal Liberation Now. The Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, issued by an international group of prominent neuroscientists meeting in Cambridge in 2012, confirms that although human beings have a more developed cerebral cortex than other animals, this part of the brain is concerned with thinking functions rather than with basic impulses, emotions, and feelings. As the declaration states, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. So just in case you doubted it, folks, the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness of 2012 is there to set you straight. Okay, so what would a world look like without speciesism, if that's even capable? And again, I would argue that it's only going to be capable really if business folks get to it and innovate so that people just don't even have to be faced with this decision. But what if business doesn't help us out? What are we going to have to accomplish on our own to not have speciesism? And what would the world look like if that took place?
Well, we would have to change people's attitudes, as I've been saying, and grow that critical mass of people who have those attitudes. And I should say, we haven't talked about it. We've been focusing on animals and their moral status. But of course, the fact that the animal meat industry produces so much greenhouse gases is another powerful reason why people are avoiding eating animal products. And I think, the consumer demand would eventually change business. If obviously business should be proactive, they should be taking the lead, they should be producing products that are easy alternatives to cook, that people are relatively familiar with, that don't involve a big change in their lifestyle or even their eating habits. So yes, business should be doing this, but I would be hopeful that it would be consumer driven anyway, that people will start to make this shift, or increasingly make this shift. We do need the alternative products to be economically competitive. That's true. Because, I mean, I've been a vegetarian for over 50 years now, and I never had a problem with cooking, before we had all of these products. I never had a problem with cooking vegetarian. There's lots of cheap, basic plant foods. I've always enjoyed making a lentil curry and a dal, and having papadums and chutneys and pickles to go with it. And there's lots of great foods. In fact, I have at the back of Animal Liberation Now, I have some of my favorite recipes, all vegan,
Yeah.
that I've always cooked with, and that don't really require any new products. But there's no doubt that it's going to make it easier for people to make that transition when there is this wide range of new products that are economically affordable, competitive on price, or even lower in price than the animal products. And they will have benefits, of course, not just for animals, but for the climate, for local environment, as you said, reducing the risks of pandemics. There's a whole range of benefits there that changing the way we eat and the way we produce our food would have.
I would argue there would be another benefit. When I gave up meat and dairy, I don't say gave up because it really wasn't hard, folks. It just really was not hard for me. But when I stopped eating meat and dairy, I thought, oh, hey, I'm going to lose a little bit of weight, which I did. And I was really happy about that. I thought, okay, I'm making this health move. But I hadn't realized what, I'll almost say, a physical weight was lifted from me when I no longer had to live in cognitive dissonance. And I hadn't realized how much that had held me back, because I was I again had seen animal factories. I knew, and I was having to rationalize to myself, I'm doing this thing that I know is wrong, and I'm doing it anyway. And is this what it means to be an adult? And how am I living with this? And when I stopped having to fight myself on this, I just got this huge lift. I'm already pretty energetic. I got this huge lift of energy that I didn't expect that I would get. And so I think of the societal benefits if en masse we don't have to live in cognitive dissonance or bullying or making fun of other people and making other people feel bad because maybe they're making a moral decision that we're not quite ready to make. And then you've got this like negativism that comes out in bullying and making fun of other people and belittling other people. If you could get rid of that around this subject, in addition to cleaning up the water supply, not having deforestation, not contributing 32% of the world's methane emissions, which come from animal agriculture, pandemic risk, the list goes on, over land use, food injustice, because animal agriculture takes so many resources that we then leave others without food because we're mismanaging our land and water use. All these practical food systems benefits. But what about that lifting of emotion that you don't have to live in cognitive dissonance anymore? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, your perspective is slightly different from mine because I don't think I was living in any cognitive dissonance. I should have been,
Ah,
but in 1970 or up to 1970, I had just accepted eating meat. I don't think I was troubled by it. I grew up in Australia, which is a country that was a big meat eating country, produces a lot of meat. And in fact, when I got the scholarship to do my graduate work in Oxford and um, said I'm going to be in Oxford for the next few years. One of the things that Australians said to me was, "Oh, the meat over there is terrible and so expensive too." Um, so I solved that problem by stopping eating it at least after I'd been there about a year. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I didn't know about factory farming. Obviously I knew that animals get slaughtered, but my vision of the animals I was eating was that they were out in the fields, having a good life, protected from predators, making sure they were always fed. And then they had this one bad day when they got rounded up and trucked off to slaughter and killed. And I was prepared to accept that. But then I did find out about factory farms, not by visiting them, but by reading them initially, although later I did visit them. But by the time I visited them, I already wasn't eating those products. Uh, so I read about them and I decided, oh, I do have to change. I can't continue doing this. So there was, if you like, there was a brief period of cognitive dissonance where I was weighing up that change and thinking about it, but it wasn't very long. So yeah, but I've certainly felt good more or less immediately in becoming a vegetarian. I'm not quite sure what it was, whether it was the lighter kind of food, that there wasn't these meals with meat that were weighing down my stomach. Meat does take longer to digest. It is a healthier diet, I'm sure, because at least any sensible vegetarian or vegan diet is, because it will have a lot more fiber in it, and that was around the time we were starting to be told that fiber is good for us. Um, so yeah, I think it has had many benefits, many personal benefits, by not eating meat or other animal products. But um, I'm not sure whether the majority of people there now do have this cognitive dissonance because factory farming is much better known. I imagine quite a lot of them do actually, but maybe not everyone yet.
yeah, I think I hold people accountable. I think most people know. They know, but they know about animal factories, but they don't know what to do about it. I also go back to that statement from the Humane Society of the United States. Republicans and Democrats both agree they don't want animals to suffer, but they don't know how to switch. The innovation isn't prolific enough, and they're not sure how to make the easy switch. So they kind of have to work it out in their head that they're not going to switch until they're just not going to switch. They're just going to turn off their ethical compass for that decision or that meal period. But it's interesting to think about what could collectively in the collective consciousness change. I work sometimes with a doctor called Dr. Ashuk. I'm always pronouncing his name wrong. Nagella, out of the state of Illinois, Cook County, and Gray's Lake facilities. And he studies mental health and the eating of a meat diet, and he probably linked to no fiber. Maybe people don't know this, but meat has no fiber. I know that's counterintuitive because it looks fibrous, but it actually has no fiber. It maybe is linked to that, but he says that it can lead to depression and brings down people's moods, as most foods that aren't good for you would do. So there's always this conversation about, are plant-based alternatives healthy? Of course, if you're going to go for the OG of plant-based, which would be, a bean and rice burrito with avocado, of course you're getting lots of fiber there, and it's not going to be very processed. But even if you go with a plant-based burger, you're not having trimethylene N oxide induced in your system, you're not having cholesterol, you're getting some fiber, you're not having antibiotics, you're not having hormones, and you're having a significantly reduced amount of saturated fat. So all this, even if it's not a carrot, will take you in the right direction, and that's towards feeling better. One would argue physically, but then Dr. Nigella would argue mentally as well. Okie dokie, as we kind of round up here, I wonder if you could help us out with something you talk about in Animal Liberation Now, the psychology's ethical dilemma.
Oh, right. So this is moving a little away from food to research on animals, because I do discuss that in the book.
You do.
And um, the ethical dilemma of psychology. So a lot of experiments, people tend to think, oh, well, we do animal experiments because we need to cure cancer or some major disease like that. And of course, there is some experimentation on animals that goes on in that area. And in fact, I quote in Animal Liberation Now a former head of the National Institutes of Health saying, we've got very good at curing cancer in mice, but it doesn't translate to humans. So that's a different problem. But let's go back to psychology. There's a lot of research on animals, including some very, very painful and distressing experiments done on animals in psychology. Things like, for example, a long series of experiments going back to the 1950s on isolating infants from monkeys,
Right.
and rearing them in total isolation, and even rearing them with mechanical monster mothers that reject them, and that which spikes emerge from the mechanical monster mother that injure the baby. And this was done to sort of show that you're going to get abnormal psychology in infants who are isolated in this way. But it went on for decades. So the dilemma for the psychologist is to say, are animals like us in terms of basically their minds, their capacities to feel things? And if, of course, the psychologists have to say, well, they are like us. That's why they're animal models. They use this term, animal models of human conditions, like whether it's depression or post-traumatic stress, or learned helplessness, which was something to model depression. So if they want to get the grants and get the money and justify doing these things to animals, they have to say it's because they're like us and will learn how to treat these human conditions. But if they are like us, then how can you justify inflicting this kind of horrible distress on animals when you would never think of doing that to humans? You would be locked up as a psychopath if you were to do those sorts of things to humans. So that's the dilemma, and that's why I think a lot of this experiment on animals by psychologists, some of which is still continuing, and I give recent examples of these experiments, really can't be justified ethically.
According to Darwin, the 6 emotions that we have in common with animals: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. That's what I have to say about that. Let's moving on, because I can't find a positive note for that one. So I will move on to conditional ethical blindness. Help us out with that
Yes,
definition.
that's also a phrase that has come out of experiments on animals, and it comes from Don Barnes, who was somebody who I got to know personally. Don Barnes was a psychologist, and he was a psychologist who ended up working for the US military. And the experiments that he was doing on behalf of the US military involved training monkeys. By the way, some people may have seen a film called Project X, which was based on what Don Barnes was doing. So Barnes was training monkeys to maneuver what was called a primate equilibrium platform, which was a kind of a platform that they were on. They were in a seat. They were strapped into a seat on this platform, and they had a control lever, a bit like a joystick in a plane, and they had to keep it level. It was it was rocking around and tilting, and they had to learn to keep it level with this joystick. And if they didn't, they got electric shocks. So that was how they were trained to learn to keep it level. But that's only the training for the experiment. That's not the experiment. Once they had learned to keep it level, they were then exposed to radiation. Um, and the radiation was the kind of thing that would happen if you dropped a nuclear bomb and then flew through the radioactive cloud of the bomb. So the point of this experiment was to see whether American pilots who dropped nuclear bombs and were exposed to the radiation from those bombs could continue to fly and bring their planes home. And to do this, these monkeys were trained on this primate equilibrium platform and exposed to radiation, made very sick, to see whether they could actually continue to keep the platform level. And that was supposed to indicate something about whether pilots would be able to fly their planes home. I mean, just describing it, it sounds crazy because obviously there are going to be many differences. And eventually, although Barnes did these experiments, um, and he was kind of told to by his superior officer, eventually, he realized that this wasn't serving any purpose, that it was absolutely horrible for the monkeys, but it wasn't serving any real purpose. That, it's not as if the Air Force was going to somehow look at this data and say, oh, therefore, our pilots can fly through these radioactive clouds from dropping nuclear bombs. Um, and so he said this, it was also costing the military a lot of money, of course, to do all this. He said, that he really thought that this shouldn't be done. And he got dismissed for doing that. And, he describes his awakening from this state that he calls conditioned ethical blindness. He'd been doing this for quite a long time and was just blind to the fact that he was harming these animals for no good purpose. And after he left the military, he became a campaigner for reform of rules relating to animal experimentation.
Happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. Maybe we can talk about something uplifting, like some of the positive changes that have happened. You talk about in the book that there have been examples of protesters that have taken to the streets, or maybe it doesn't even need to be that much for change. I'm still rooting for business to do its innovative thing, but there have been some examples where things have changed for animals.
Yes, things have changed, and I think the world leader is the European Union, and I would include the ex-European Union member, the United Kingdom, which has basically retained similar laws. Uh, they have prohibited the standard battery cages for egg-laying hens, for example, very small bare wire cages in which hens are crowded. They can't even stretch their wings. If there were one bird in a cage, she couldn't stretch her wings fully, and there may be four or
To
more hens
six.
in those
Yeah.
cages. Similarly, individual stalls for sows, I already mentioned, that they can't turn around in, and for veal calves. Those are prohibited now throughout all 27 nations of the European Union and the United Kingdom. Um, but in the United States, the majority of eggs produced in the United States still come from hens kept in those standard battery cages. There have been change. You mentioned having spoken to Josh Bulk on this program. He led a campaign for the Humane Society of the United States, which has seen maybe a third of the hens out of cages, still maybe crowded indoors, but no longer in cages. Um, some pressure on corporations like McDonald's, who said they would stop buying pig products from producers that kept their sows in stalls they couldn't turn around in. That kind of thing has made some progress. So, yeah, but I think the real interesting sign, and you were talking about what people are capable of. The really interesting sign in the United States is that the progress that has been made is in those states that allow referenda. that allow citizens-initiated referenda where they can vote on these issues. So California is a good example, is the biggest of these states. They have had two different referenda to put before the people whether they want to change the way animals are kept in factory farms, whether they want to give all animals in farms room to move around, to stretch their limbs without bumping into another animal or into the side of their cage. And twice Californians have overwhelmingly voted in favor of those changes. Um, and by big margins. You start off by saying animal welfare is something that both Republicans and Democrats agree on, and I think that that's been shown. So the margin for this proposition that was one of these propositions in California was put to the voters in the same year that President Obama was elected. Now he got a big majority in California, right? California was not a contested state really. But the proposition to overturn, to change the conditions of farmed animals, got a bigger majority than Obama got in that election. And in Massachusetts, not very long ago, a similar referendum got 78% of the votes. So I think the real problem in the United States is that the political system does not respond to the views of the electors in the way that the European Union nations have a political systems that do respond, and the United Kingdom. I think there's too much money, too much agribusiness lobbying going on, and that's preventing the kind of change at the federal level that I'm quite sure if people were to vote just on that issue, they would vote for those changes.
There's too much protection of industry such that the consumer is misinformed. They're quite honestly often intentionally misled or just simply don't have access to information. This is why we started this conversation about ag gag laws, not allowing for any videos, images, information to come out of animal factories. I don't refer to them as factory farms just because I have so much respect for farmers and the work that they do and their connection to the land and their natural existence. And of course, that has nothing to do with this, which is concrete skyscrapers, as we discussed in China, for example. So, you're not allowed to see into these places. And that tells you something because if you were, people wouldn't agree to them. So there's a problem with democracy right there. But there is change. We are living in a misinformation age, but also an incredible information age. And that information is often at our fingertips. So I do believe that we will look back on this time while I'm still alive, like I'm going to say in the next 30 years. And as animal agriculture does transition out, and I believe it will, we'll say that we can't believe that women couldn't vote in Switzerland until the 1990s. I believe I have that right. And that animals were treated this way well into the late 2020, 2025, 2030, 2050, et cetera. So we have a ways to go, but I do believe that we're changing. As we wrap up, let's talk about what do you see happening, I'll say, in the next 10 years for our global food supply system. To be clear, in animal liberation now, you do talk about two areas of speciesism, animal factories and animal experimentation. So for this question, we'll just talk about animal factories. How do you see the global food supply system changing?
I believe that it will change significantly over the next decade. I think it has to for climate change reasons, because increasingly the methane that ruminant animals produce is going to become an important factor in climate change as we move to more solar and other renewable ways of producing electricity without fossil fuels. The methane emissions of animals are going to become a larger proportion of what we're still putting into the atmosphere. So I think it has to change for that reason quite rapidly. I think it will change also from consumer demand, including people who are concerned about the suffering of animals as they learn more about that and as they get other alternatives. And once we do have these alternatives and they're economically competitive with the animal products, people will buy them and then they will be freed up to think about the ethics of how we treat animals without feeling, oh, I can't really think about this because it will spoil my dinner. Because it won't be spoiling their dinner anymore, and they'll be able to feel good about the fact that they're not eating animals and animal products.
Come on, lucky seven. Let's get there, everybody. Let's get there. Investors, you know what to do. Start investing because that's how we get innovation. That's how we get real change. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
10 years ago. I'm not sure what I've learned in the last 10 years, really. Is all that important. I think 10 years ago, I probably knew most of the things that I know now, having been around for quite a while before that. But I'm looking forward to more changes. I guess one thing I didn't think about 10 years ago was the role that AI could play in
Hmm.
designing new plant-based foods and in replacing animals in experimentation. Um, so I think AI is scary in some ways, but it also holds some positive promises.
Yeah, yeah. I've been having fun with ChatGPT, by the way. Okay, let's say you're running around, you are doing book tour for Animal Liberation now, and you miss a flight or something's not going your way. Is there a phrase you tell yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
Um, I sometimes say, I think this is a phrase I got from my wife. No child will die because I missed my plane.
Okay, okay. Noted. Okay, taking the dire circumstance there. Same day, you are running around still on book tour for Animal Liberation now, and you don't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
Oh, it really depends whatever is available. Um,
Do you
I
carry with
sometimes
you like nuts or anything that's like your favorite on the plane? I'm gonna make sure I have it with me.
I sometimes carry these little little vegan protein bars, muesli bars, sort of things.
Yeah.
That's probably the handiest sort of small snack if I miss
Yeah.
lunch.
Small
Yeah,
and light.
yeah.
Peter Singer, I want to thank you for being with me today. Thank you for animal liberation. Thank you for being a voice for animals for 50 solid years, 5 decades. I'm so excited that Animal Liberation now is out. Everybody, you know what to do. Amazon, go get your book or go to the bookstore, just whatever have you. But Animal Liberation now, we talked about a couple horror stories here, but it does have some glimmers of hope for the future as we shift our global food supply system. We always try to keep it happy here, relatively speaking. And if you are lucky enough to catch Peter Singer on book tour, he is in the United States. Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., all of it. So go
San
to
Francisco as well.
San Francisco as well. Go to petersinger.com. Is that right?
Uh,
Petersinger.com
uh,
for the.
I do need to put these dates on that site, so yes,
Okay.
let's do that. Also, the tour is being run by Think Inc. Think INC. And if you Google Think Inc. Peter Singer, you will also get directly to where you can get tickets.
That is beautiful. Peter Singer, of course, is a
Uh,
member
uh,
of the VegTech Invest Thought Leadership Council,
yeah.
so I'm grateful to him in more ways than one.
Sorry, I think you said petersinger.com. It's petersinger.info. Did you say Peter?
Ooh, I did
Yeah.
say petersinger.com. It's petersinger.info. Okay, petersinger.info. Everybody, you know what to do. Go get those tours. Go get your book signed in person. How fun. Everybody should have a very classic copy of Animal Liberation and Animal Liberation. Now, Peter, I hope that you will come back because as we change the global food supply system, you and me and everybody listening to this podcast, we're going to document the changes that we see. So, just again, thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll be very happy to come back on the program.
So kind of you. Everybody on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, I will see you next week. Wasn't this fantastic? So happy that he's here. Everybody, I'll see you next week. Peter, stay put.